The street was dimly lit, the shadows stretching long across the cracked pavement. A quiet hum of city traffic in the distance only added to the eerie stillness of the alley where the confrontation was about to unfold. The air was thick with tension, a storm of emotions brewing beneath the surface of what seemed like an ordinary evening. 4 figures, draped in dark clothing, loitered near the entrance to a rundown convenience store. They weren't there for any particular reason, except for the thrill they got from causing trouble, especially when they could do it without fear of consequences. This was their territory, a place where they felt untouchable. They were the kind of people who believed that their power came from the color of their skin and the force of their numbers. A group of young men, fueled by anger and a sense of superiority, with their racist ideologies simmering beneath the surface. They thrived on fear, and nothing gave them more pleasure than seeing someone smaller, weaker, or different cower before them. Jared, the self-proclaimed leader, was the first to spot her. A woman, walking alone, her pace steady, yet purposeful. She was black, tall, with striking features that made her stand out, but it was the way she carried herself that intrigued him. There was something in her posture, confident, unshakable, that caught his eye. "Hey, look at this one," Jared sneered, nudging the others in the group. "We've got ourselves a little trophy tonight, boys." The others chuckled, a low, menacing sound that echoed down the alley. They had no idea who she was, but that didn't matter. To them, she was just another target, another person who didn't belong in their world. "Hey, sweetheart," Jared called out, his voice dripping with mock sweetness. "You lost or something?" The woman didn't respond immediately, her eyes forward as if she hadn't heard him. That only fueled Jared's sense of entitlement. He took a few steps forward, blocking her path, his gang following closely behind. "What? No response?" he taunted, his voice growing louder. "Is that how you people are? Too good to talk to us?" Her expression remained neutral, but inside, a fire began to stir. She had been through countless situations like this before, but there was something about the sheer ignorance in their taunts that made it different this time. The racial slurs came in quick succession, each word a slap to the face, each insult a reminder of the hatred she had long learned to navigate. "You think you're better than us, don't you?" Another voice rang out, one of the others in the group stepping forward with a leering grin. "Well, you're just another black bitch in our way." The woman's jaw tightened, but she remained silent, hoping they would lose interest. She had learned the art of choosing her battles. She could walk away, escape the situation without a fight. But she could feel the surge of aggression building within the group, their anger becoming more palpable with each passing second. Jared wasn't finished. "What's the matter? You too proud to speak? Or is it that you think we're beneath you?" He took a step closer, his hand brushing her arm. That was the breaking point. Her instincts, honed through years of combat training, kicked in like a reflex. Without warning, she spun around, her arm shooting out to grab his wrist, twisting it with surgical precision. He yelped in pain, his grip faltering, and in that split second, the others realized they had underestimated her. The woman moved like a shadow, her body fluid and controlled, each motion executed with the expertise of someone who had faced danger many times before. Jared tried to pull away, but her hold was unyielding. She shoved him back with a force that sent him crashing into a stack of empty crates. The other men froze for a moment, shocked by her sudden ferocity. But it was only a moment. Jared's gang wasn't known for backing down, especially not to someone they perceived as weaker. "You're gonna regret that, bitch," one of them spat, pulling a knife from his jacket. The woman's eyes never wavered from the group, her expression cool, calculating. She had seen this before. These were the kind of people who, when confronted with a challenge, reacted with mindless aggression. She was prepared for that. What they didn't know, however, was that she wasn't just any woman. She had been trained in the most elite military units, honed to perfection in combat. They were about to learn a very hard lesson. Before the knife could come close, she darted forward, using her opponent's momentum against him, twisting his wrist and forcing him to drop the weapon. He stumbled backward, wide-eyed, and for a brief moment, the gang realized they were no longer in control. But it was too late for them to turn back. The other two charged at her simultaneously, fists flying. She sidestepped with ease, ducking under one punch while landing a solid strike to the second man's midsection, knocking the wind out of him. He gasped for air, crumpling to the ground. Jared, now struggling to rise from the pile of crates, roared in fury. His pride was wounded, but his anger clouded his judgment. He lunged at her, thinking brute strength would overcome her. But she was too fast. She spun around, tripping him with a quick, fluid motion, sending him crashing to the ground once again. The fight was over before it had even truly begun. The gang, once so sure of their power, was now lying defeated in a heap of confusion and fear. As the woman stood over them, her breathing steady, she felt a strange sense of calm. They had underestimated her, and they would pay the price for it. But just as quickly as the fight began, it ended. Without saying a word, she turned on her heel and walked away, leaving the group in stunned silence. The silence hung thick in the air, broken only by the sound of heavy breathing and the distant hum of traffic. As she disappeared into the night, the gang members could only lie there, bruised and battered, each one struggling to comprehend what had just happened. They had picked the wrong fight, and now they would have to live with the consequences. And as for her? She was already gone, her past a shadow she kept hidden. But in that moment, it was clear. They had just learned the hard way what happens when you cross someone who had spent years training to survive in a world much harsher than their own. The alley was quiet now, except for the muffled sound of footsteps fading into the distance. Jared, the leader of the gang, was the first to regain his senses after the shock of the confrontation. His lip was bleeding, but his pride hurt more. He slowly rose to his feet, scanning the others. They were all disoriented, still processing what had just happened. What the hell was that? Jared muttered, wiping blood from his face. His tone was confused but angry. They had been in plenty of fights before, but this was different. They had underestimated her. Ralph, the more cynical member of the gang, was the first to speak up. This isn't like any fight we've had. She was different. Jared's eyes narrowed. She knew what she was doing. This wasn't just some random woman. Damn it. She was trained. Look at us. We barely touched her and then she turned the whole thing around on us, Ralph said, his voice tinged with nervousness. The rest of the gang nodded slowly, still trying to comprehend what had just happened. Jared's anger began to build. He couldn't let this go. The thought of being humiliated by a woman was too much to handle. We're gonna find her, Jared said, his voice low and filled with determination. We can't just let her get away with this. As he pulled out his phone and dialed a number, Ralph's unease grew. Are you sure about this, man? What if we're dealing with someone more dangerous than we think? Jared didn't respond right away. He was too focused on the phone call. The voice on the other end was sharp and calm. Yeah, we found her. She's not what she seems. We need backup, now. The voice paused for a moment. You really think you can handle her? She's not just some street thug. She's got skills. Jared's stomach dropped, but he didn't let the doubt show. Just send the backup, he ordered. He hung up quickly, his mind racing. Whoever she was trouble. But he wasn't going to let some woman make a fool out of him. Meanwhile, the woman had already put distance between herself and the scene. She walked briskly, not running, but not slowing down either. She had been in enough dangerous situations to know how to remain calm. But this time, something felt different. The gang had attacked quickly, as if they knew exactly who she was. She had been able to defend herself easily, but the whole encounter felt too clean, too prepared. She didn't feel fear, she was used to danger. But something nagged at her, a quiet unease that she couldn't shake. Why had they targeted her so quickly? Did they know who she was? She didn't have time to dwell on it. She needed to keep moving, keep her focus. The city was quiet at this hour, but she knew that wouldn't last long. They would come after her, and she had to be ready. Her thoughts raced, analyzing every possible scenario. She was trained to handle situations like this, but this time felt different. It wasn't just about survival, it was about dealing with something, or someone, she hadn't expected. Back in the alley, Jared's gang was still trying to process the defeat. Their bruised bodies and shattered confidence were proof enough that they had been outmatched. But Jared wasn't about to let them back down. His pride was on the line, and he wasn't going to let some woman make him look weak in front of his crew. "We're not letting this slide," Jared said, his voice filled with new determination. "She's a threat to us, and we're going to make sure she knows who she's messing with." Ralph looked at him skeptically. "And what if she's more than just some street fighter? What if she's connected to something bigger?" Jared's eyes locked onto Ralph's, his face hardening. "We're going after her, and we're going to finish this." With that, the gang began to regroup, getting back into their cars and preparing for round 2. Jared's mind was set. He wasn't going to let anyone make him look weak, not again. He would find her and make sure she paid for what she did. The woman was already on the move again, her senses on high alert. She didn't look back, but she could feel them coming. She knew they would come after her. The question was, how long would it take them to catch up? She was ready for them. She always had been. But this time, there was something more at stake. This wasn't just another fight. This was about power, control, and she wasn't going to let anyone take that from her. She tightened her grip on the knife hidden in her ankle sheath, a familiar comfort. It wasn't just for show. She had used it countless times before, and it had always kept her safe. But tonight was different. Tonight she wasn't just surviving. She was going to take control of the situation, and she wasn't going to let anyone stop her. As she turned a corner, her heartbeat quickened. She could feel them drawing closer. She had no intention of running forever, but she had to make sure she wasn't cornered. Not yet. Not until she was ready. Back in the alley, Jared's gang was already preparing for the hunt. They were angry now, their pride wounded, and they weren't going to let a woman get the better of them. They were going to find her and show her exactly who she had messed with. "We're not letting her get away," Jared muttered to himself as they piled into their cars. "She won't be able to hide forever." But the woman was already gone, moving through the night like a shadow, her every step calculated, her mind focused. They had underestimated her once. They wouldn't make the same mistake again. The tension in the air was palpable. The woman, now deeper into the maze of dark streets, could feel their presence drawing nearer. They weren't making any attempts to hide their approach. She knew they were coming. Jared and his gang were hungry for retribution, and this time, she had no intention of running. Her pulse was steady, her thoughts sharp, but deep inside, something stirred. The streets felt tighter now. Her instincts screamed that this wasn't just another gang pursuit. They had become something far more dangerous, far more personal. She wasn't dealing with ordinary thugs anymore. These men were being led by someone who wasn't going to stop until he got what he wanted. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the knife at her side again. It was a comfort, but also a reminder of the stakes. She had been through countless battles, but this was different. The streetlights flickered above her, casting fleeting shadows across the pavement. She didn't allow herself to be distracted, though. Every detail, every corner, every sound was calculated. She knew the game was changing. They were closing in faster than she'd expected. She had led them on a chase, hoping to find an escape route, but the alleyways and streets she had once known felt like a trap now. They were relentless. As the sound of tires screeching echoed in the distance, her breath hitched. It wasn't just the hum of cars on the streets anymore. This was the unmistakable sound of pursuit. Their vehicles were getting closer. But she wasn't the type to give up. She darted down an alley, her movements fluid, calculated. She had been in worse situations, and each one had made her stronger. But as the footsteps grew closer, she realized it wasn't just about survival anymore. She was going to have to fight. Back in the vehicles, Jared's anger was seething. The woman had evaded them for too long. The fact that she was still out there, still free, enraged him. He wasn't just a gang leader, he was a predator, and he hated being made to feel weak. This woman had humiliated him and his crew, and he couldn't let that slide. "We're not stopping until we find her," Jared barked, his eyes locked on the road ahead, his grip tight on the steering wheel. "She's not just some random street rat. We're dealing with someone who knows exactly what she's doing." Ralph, sitting next to him, glanced out the window, his face drawn with worry. "We need to be careful, Jared. I'm telling you, this isn't some ordinary fight. She's dangerous. I don't care how dangerous she is. She'll pay for what she did," Jared growled. They kept their eyes on the roads, the streets growing darker as they searched. Every turn they took, every corner they passed, was a possible hideout for her. The city was a jungle, and she had the skills to disappear into it. But they were relentless. They had to find her. She heard them. The cars. The footsteps. They were closing in. Her breath quickened as her body tensed. But she couldn't run forever. She needed to turn the tables, to gain control of the situation before it spiraled further out of hand. As she neared an intersection, she quickly ducked into a shadowed doorway, her back pressed against the cold concrete wall. Her mind raced, calculating her next move. She was outnumbered, but she had the advantage of experience. She knew how to use the environment to her advantage. She could hear their voices now, the growl of their engines approaching. They were almost on top of her. It was now or never. Suddenly, she sprang into action. Jared's vehicle screeched to a halt, just a few meters from the intersection. The moment he stepped out, he could feel the weight of the situation. He had been hunting this woman for hours, and now he could sense they were close. The city had turned into a labyrinth of danger, but they were getting closer. His gang spread out, moving swiftly, checking every corner, every alley. But something wasn't right. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. They weren't alone. Before he could react, the sound of quick, calculated movement sliced through the air. From the shadows, she appeared like a phantom, silent but deadly. She moved so quickly that Jared barely had time to raise his gun before she was on him. In a blur of motion, she grabbed his arm, twisting it behind his back with a sickening crack. Jared gasped in pain, his weapon falling from his hand as he tried to fight her off, but she was too quick, too strong. Her knee slammed into his side, knocking the wind out of him as she forced him to the ground. The rest of the gang froze in shock. The tables had turned, and they didn't know how to react. Their leader, their driving force, was on the ground, struggling to get free. Panic set in as they scrambled to regroup. She wasn't done. Her movements were fluid, efficient. There was no hesitation, no uncertainty in her actions. One by one, the gang members tried to close in on her, but she was always one step ahead. She ducked under a swing, delivering a swift blow to a man's throat that sent him gasping for air, his legs buckling beneath him. Another lunged at her, but she caught his wrist, flipping him to the ground in a blur of movement that left him dazed and defeated. Jared, struggling to regain his footing, reached for his gun, but before he could pull it from his waistband, she was on him again. She had anticipated his move, and in an instant, the gun was in her hands, pointed at his chest. For a moment, there was silence. The gang members, their faces pale with shock, looked on in disbelief. Their leader, the man who had always been in control, was now on his knees, his life in the hands of the woman they had underestimated. "Next time," she said coldly, her voice barely a whisper, "don't make the mistake of thinking you can control everything. Some battles aren't yours to fight." She stepped back, the gun still trained on him, and slowly walked away. Her steps were measured, confident. Jared's eyes burned with anger and humiliation as she disappeared into the night, leaving his gang in disarray. They had failed. And in that moment he knew they had encountered something much more dangerous than they could have ever imagined. The woman had won. The woman's footsteps echoed through the alley, fading into the distance, her form blending into the shadows like a ghost. Jared stayed on the cold, grimy pavement, his face pressed to the ground, his pride shattered. His body ached from the brutal treatment, but it was the humiliation that stung the most. He had never been so thoroughly defeated, not in 1,000 street fights, not even in the worst situations. He struggled to get to his feet, his chest heaving as he looked around at his gang. The air was thick with the taste of failure. The men stood there, frozen, like animals caught in a trap, their faces blank with disbelief. "What the hell just happened?" Ralph muttered under his breath, his voice strained, his body trembling. Jared couldn't answer him. His hands shook as he pulled himself up, and as he did, he glanced at his crew. The situation was unraveling fast, and he knew it. There was no plan anymore, no simple revenge. She had turned everything upside down. "You guys, are you seriously gonna just stand there?" Jared growled, his voice hoarse with anger. He could feel the panic creeping up his spine as his thoughts raced. "We're not done. We're not backing down." But even as he spoke, he knew something had shifted. This wasn't just about catching her anymore. It was about reclaiming something far more fragile, his own sense of power. It was all slipping away, and the more he tried to grasp it, the more he felt himself losing control. Ralph looked at him, his eyes wide, his face pale. "Jared, we need to get out of here. This isn't worth it." Jared's eyes locked onto him, filled with a mix of fury and disbelief. "What the hell are you talking about? You think I'm just gonna walk away from this? You think she can humiliate me like that and just disappear?" Ralph didn't answer. He didn't need to. He knew the man in front of him was spiraling, and it was only a matter of time before it led to something even worse. Meanwhile, the woman had already disappeared into the labyrinth of streets. She moved quickly, but without panic. Her training had kicked in, and now, it was time to let the adrenaline settle. She needed to think. She needed to prepare. She knew they'd be back. This wasn't over. She found a quiet spot, crouching down behind a row of dumpsters. She checked the knife at her side once more, then pressed her palm to her forehead, letting out a slow breath. Her mind was racing, calculating every possible move. She couldn't afford to make another mistake. Not now. For a moment, the weight of the situation hit her. She wasn't just being chased by some low-level thugs. These men were determined, desperate, and now more dangerous than ever. They had tasted defeat, and Jared wasn't someone who would let that go easily. She needed to get ahead of them, outsmart them again. She quickly moved through the alley, her mind sharp. Every turn she took, every decision, was crucial. This wasn't about survival anymore. This was about winning. If they caught her in the open, if they outsmarted her, she was done. As she moved deeper into the city, a part of her couldn't help but feel the weight of what she had done. The gang would be relentless, but she had known from the start that this wasn't just about defending herself. She had her reasons for confronting them, and now she was paying the price for it. Back in the alley, Jared's rage was building, and it was taking a toll on his control. His crew was scattered, trying to regroup, but they weren't united anymore. The moment he had realized they had been outmatched, his confidence had crumbled. Now, his anger fueled him more than anything. The gang had always been his domain, his rule. They were supposed to follow him, listen to him, and now they were questioning everything. "Ralph, you're not going soft on me now, are you?" Jared spat, taking a few steps toward him. "Get the others together. We're going after her." Ralph backed away, shaking his head. "This is getting out of hand, man. We can't keep chasing after her. She's something else. We need to rethink this." But Jared wasn't listening anymore. His mind was made up, and in his eyes burned the raw need for revenge. He stormed toward the others, barking orders. "You all stay with me. We're going after her." Ralph opened his mouth to argue but then closed it, his face sinking into defeat. He knew Jared wasn't going to back down. Not now. Not ever. And deep down, Ralph knew that this wouldn't end well for any of them. But there was no stopping Jared. The woman was aware of their pursuit. She could feel them getting closer, their search growing more frantic. But she didn't run. She didn't need to. She had already set her trap. As Jared's gang began to fan out, driving through the streets in their cars, the woman watched them from a rooftop, her sharp eyes scanning their every move. She could tell they were desperate now. Jared wasn't just hunting her. He was hunting his own dignity, and in the process, he was pushing his crew to the brink. She could hear their cars below, the screech of tires, the curses as they turned down every wrong street. It was almost pathetic. She had them exactly where she wanted them. They didn't know it yet, but they were walking right into her hands. She smiled to herself. It wouldn't be long now. Jared's nerves were on edge as the hunt continued. He could feel the city closing in on him, each turn, each street, leading him further into unfamiliar territory. The gang had split up, but even with their numbers, they were moving slower. His anger, his rage, it was starting to slip into panic. He couldn't let that happen. "Where the hell is she?" Jared growled, slamming his fist against the dashboard. Ralph didn't answer, his eyes darting nervously from side to side. He had the distinct feeling that they were being played. And then it happened. The crash. The sound of metal against metal filled the air, a scream of tires, and then the explosion of glass. Ralph's eyes widened in horror as their car slammed into a hidden trap, an ambush. The woman had set them up, leading them into a dead-end street, where a series of strategically placed objects had triggered the crash. Jared slammed against his seatbelt, his face white. What the hell? But it was too late. The woman was already in motion. She dropped from the rooftop, landing softly behind the wrecked car, her figure a shadow of precision. Her steps were silent, but her presence felt like a storm on the horizon. The final battle had begun. The wrecked car was silent, its engine sputtering and smoke billowing from the hood. The gang members, shaken and disoriented, struggled to regain their bearings as the woman stood in the shadows, her eyes cold and calculating. They had walked right into her trap, and now, there was no way out. Jared was the first to recover, his chest heaving as he fumbled for his gun. His hand was shaking, sweat dripping down his face. His mind raced with panic and anger. They had underestimated her, and now he could feel it. This was the final moment. This was his last chance to reclaim control. "You think you've won?" Jared's voice was hoarse, but defiant. He staggered toward the wreckage, his gun aimed in her direction. "You're nothing but a freak. You're not the one in charge here." The woman didn't flinch. She didn't even move. Her presence alone was enough to fill the street with an eerie calm. The seconds felt like hours as the gang members slowly gathered themselves, eyes darting around, realizing that they were completely outmatched. "Put the gun down, Jared," the woman said, her voice quiet but firm. It was a command, not a request. "You're already beaten." Jared's finger tightened on the trigger, but before he could pull it, the woman moved. In a blur, she crossed the distance between them, her body an unyielding force. The gun was knocked from his hand before he even saw her coming, her palm slamming into his chest with the power of a battering ram. Jared stumbled back, his breath leaving him in a sharp gasp, his world spinning as he tried to regain his footing. For a split second, Jared thought he might actually win this. He thought he might overpower her. But then he saw the look in her eyes. It wasn't the look of someone who was playing a game. It was the look of someone who had already won. Without hesitation, she grabbed his throat, her grip tightening like a vice. His eyes bulged in shock and fear as he tried to pry her hand away, but it was no use. She was too strong. The others stood frozen, terrified, unsure of what to do. The situation had turned from a chase into a nightmare. She leaned in close, her voice barely a whisper. "This is where it ends. You don't get to control me. You don't get to hurt anyone anymore." Jared gasped for air, his mind scrambling. His crew had watched, paralyzed as their leader's defiance melted away. One by one, they began to realize what had been clear from the start. They were nothing compared to her. She wasn't just a woman, they could see that now. She was a warrior, and they were just fools caught in her web. Her grip loosened on his throat, and Jared dropped to the ground, gasping for air, his body trembling with fear and humiliation. His gun was just a few feet away, but he knew better than to try for it. He was done. She turned her back to him and addressed the rest of the gang. "Get out of here. You're not going to win. You're not even close." For the first time, the men looked at each other, unsure of how to proceed. Their fear was palpable, and the gang's leader, Jared, lay defeated at their feet, unable to offer any guidance. Ralph stepped forward hesitantly, his voice shaky. "Please. We were just following orders. We didn't know who you were. We never meant to." The woman raised her hand, silencing him. "It's too late for apologies." Without another word, she turned and began walking away, her steps slow but purposeful. She knew that this wasn't over yet. The city was full of predators, and some would never stop hunting her. But for now, for this moment, she had won. Jared and his crew remained on the ground, broken and defeated, their world turned upside down by a woman they had thought was nothing more than a victim. They had learned the hard way that appearances could be deceiving, and in the end, it was their arrogance, not her weakness, that had led to their downfall. As she disappeared into the night, the gang's shame was all that remained. They had come for revenge, but instead, they had found a force of nature they couldn't comprehend, someone who had fought wars they could never imagine. The city swallowed her whole, and the shadows closed in around her. But she knew, deep down, that they wouldn't give up. No one ever did. The question was, would they be ready for her when she came for them next? Only time would tell. And the woman? She would always be ready.